The Alabama woods in 1935 were dense and suffocating, a labyrinth of ancient oaks and twisting roots that swallowed sunlight whole. Few dared venture too deep, and those who did returned with vague tales of whispers in the dark and shadows that moved with intent. It was into this suffocating green that the outsider wandered, drawn by fragments of rumor and the desperate allure of a story untold. Locals avoided the main road that cut through the forest, crossing themselves when the topic of the family came up. "Don't speak their name," one old man warned, his voice quivering like the dying leaves in the wind. They don't like eyes in their woods." The outsider thought it superstition, until the first signs appeared, symbols etched deep into tree bark, some resembling human figures twisted into grotesque contortions, and small altars littered with bones stripped clean. At night, the forest breathed differently, a heavy, almost sentient silence broken by low murmurs that seemed neither wind nor animal. And then, the homestead emerged, part ruin, part shrine, hidden beneath a canopy so thick it seemed the sun had never touched it. The air smelled faintly of earth and decay, an invisible weight pressing down with every step closer. Figures moved inside, blurred by shadow, chanting in a tongue that made the outsider's blood congeal. Through the cracks of the old cabin, a vision worse than mere rumor unfolded: women kneeling, hooded figures circling, and the unmistakable presence of the dead, preserved, manipulated, worshipped. The outsider realized that what had been whispered in hushed tones was real. The family's bloodline was maintained through rites that defied nature, through rituals that bound life and death in ways that made the forest itself shiver. Each heartbeat felt like trespass, each breath a sin. It was clear the forest had eyes, the family had ways, and the outsider's presence had already been noted. Leaving was not merely difficult, it was impossible without inviting the full wrath of a family whose obsession with purity had twisted them beyond the edge of humanity. The story they had come for was alive, watching, and very much unwilling to let its secrets go. In the sweltering heat of Alabama in 1935, the outsider arrived with the quiet determination of someone chasing a story that the world seemed determined to forget. He was a man of curiosity, one who had spent years combing through dusty records, interviewing wary townsfolk, and following the faintest threads of rumor, and now those threads had led him to the outskirts of a small, decaying town where the roads were more dirt than pavement and the locals' eyes held a mix of fear and suspicion. The town itself seemed suspended in time, as though it had been cut off from the outside world, and the outsider felt the weight of that isolation pressing down on him the moment he stepped off the wagon path. Children ran in scattered groups through dusty yards, disappearing behind sagging fences, while women peered cautiously from porches, clutching shawls tightly around their shoulders as if shielding themselves from unseen terrors. There was an unspoken understanding in their gazes, a warning that there were places and families within the surrounding woods that were not meant for wandering eyes. The outsider had heard whispers during his journey about the family that lived deep in the forest, a family rumored to be so isolated, so insular, that they had become legends, the kind of tales parents used to frighten children into obedience. Yet these were not simple ghost stories. The locals spoke of them in hushed, urgent tones, as if even mentioning them aloud might summon the wrong kind of attention. It was said that the family's rituals were strange, macabre, and bordered on blasphemy, and though details were scarce, the outsider could sense the collective fear that had grown over decades like a shadow stretching through the town. As he walked toward the edge of the forest, the transition was almost imperceptible. The familiar sounds of the town, the clatter of tools, the creak of swinging gates, the distant bark of dogs, faded into a hollow, uneasy quiet. The forest seemed to inhale around him, drawing him in with a deliberate patience, each step further removing him from safety and certainty. In his satchel were notebooks filled with prior observations, sketches of symbols, and fragmented accounts of travelers who had glimpsed the family from afar, but none of these records could prepare him for the palpable tension that thrummed through the air. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his boot felt like an alert to something hidden, watching, waiting. And though he reminded himself that he had come to document, to understand, and to reveal, a part of him already feared that this story was not one meant to be uncovered, that some secrets buried in the depths of the Alabama woods were protected not only by isolation but by the silent, implacable will of those who had long ago decided that no outsider would ever walk away with the truth. As the outsider ventured deeper toward the forest's edge, The first signs of oddity began to reveal themselves in ways that defied ordinary explanation. At first, they were subtle, almost easy to dismiss, tree bark scarred in peculiar patterns that did not resemble the natural wear of weather or animals, lines etched with a precision that suggested intent rather than chance. Some shapes were geometric, sharp angles cutting across the trunks like crude warnings, while others resembled distorted human figures, their limbs twisted unnaturally, reaching or grasping in silent agony. He paused often, sketching these symbols in his notebook, trying to make sense of them, but each mark seemed designed to unsettle rather than communicate. Around these trees, the undergrowth was strangely disturbed, as if someone or something had moved through in deliberate paths that never followed the forest's natural rhythms. Small altars of bone and wood appeared intermittently, each arrangement more unnerving than the last. Animal skulls were positioned with careful symmetry, fragments of feathers and dried blood incorporated in ways that suggested ritualistic purpose rather than decay. The outsider felt the weight of a presence that was not entirely human, as if the forest itself had been shaped by something with knowledge beyond the ordinary, a knowledge that used the living and the dead alike in its designs. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of small offerings tucked in the hollows of trees, cracked coins, splintered pieces of pottery, and fragments of thread that bore stains too dark and rusted to be anything innocent. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed charged, thickening with an unspoken tension that pressed against his chest. Birds fell silent, and even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing the leaves with a cautious touch, as though aware of intrusions. The outsider's journal began to fill rapidly, his hands trembling as he recorded each symbol, each arrangement, each oddity that suggested a pattern beyond randomness. Yet even as he documented these signs, a creeping realization took hold. The forest itself felt alive with awareness, a silent observer that both guided and tested him. He could no longer dismiss the notion that these markings were messages, warnings, or perhaps invitations, each one part of a deliberate system known only to those who dwelled within the hidden compound. Shadows seemed to gather around him, converging with the lines on the trees, creating forms that suggested motion even when nothing moved. The further he pressed, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary forest, no ordinary family, and no ordinary isolation. Every mark, every altar, every symbol was part of a tapestry designed to warn outsiders, to prepare them, and perhaps, in some sinister way, to draw them in. A growing dread settled in his stomach as he realized that the woods were not merely concealing the family, they were communicating with him, assessing his presence, and making sure he understood, long before he even glimpsed the homestead, that what lay ahead was both deliberate and deeply unnatural, a world operating under rules that were not his own. Rumors of death and desecration began to surface almost immediately as the outsider spent more time in the surrounding town, though no one spoke of them openly. Conversations started cautiously, with villagers lowering their voices until they were nearly whispers, eyes darting toward the woods as if the trees themselves were listening. It was said that bodies had vanished from the local cemeteries, graves disturbed in the dead of night, their contents removed with a precision that defied natural explanation. Old women spoke of coffins found open at dawn, lids splintered, and sometimes even the faint trace of footsteps leading into the forest, footprints that ended abruptly at the edge of thick underbrush. Children claimed to hear voices calling them in the night, faint and urgent, sometimes in tones that were half crying, half chanting. The outsider pressed for details, gently prodding at these stories, yet each account was fragmented, full of hesitation and fear. What struck him most was not the lack of clarity but the consistency of the fear, the way even the most skeptical townsfolk shifted uncomfortably when the subject arose, as though the act of speaking it aloud might summon the unseen watchers that haunted the woods. Tales emerged of travelers who had gone missing along the forest paths, their wagons found abandoned at strange angles, possessions scattered as if thrown aside, while their bodies were never recovered. Local law enforcement, sparse and weary, often brushed these disappearances aside, labeling them accidents or misadventures, but the outsider noticed the subtle signs of their unease: furrowed brows, lingering stares at the tree line, hands twitching near weapons they rarely drew. Even those with no direct connection to the family seemed to carry the weight of knowing, as though the fear had seeped into the soil itself. And while these stories were terrifying on their own, it was the suggestion of ritual behind them that chilled him most. Villagers hinted at rites that involved manipulating the dead, that the family did not merely hide bodies but used them for purposes that no ordinary mind could comprehend, acts that violated both faith and nature. The outsider began to recognize a pattern. The fear was not of death alone, but of what came after, the way the family seemed to exert influence even over the departed. In hushed tones, he learned that offerings had been stolen from graves, sometimes whole coffins displaced, always leaving an unsettling sense of violation that lingered like a stain on the earth. The realization grew gradually, a cold weight pressing at the edges of his awareness. This was not a collection of mere local superstitions, nor were these crimes haphazard. They were deliberate, precise, and cloaked in secrecy, forming a chain of terror that bound the town in quiet complicity and fear. And as the outsider pieced these fragments together, he began to understand that every vanished body, every disturbed grave, every whispered account of unnatural acts was a signpost pointing toward the heart of a ritualistic horror that had thrived in the shadows for generations, waiting for someone to stumble too close. After days of following the faint trails through the thick Alabama forest, the outsider finally stumbled upon the family compound, though compound hardly captured the unsettling presence it projected. Hidden beneath the dense canopy, the homestead appeared abandoned at first glance, a decaying structure of rotting wood and sagging porches, shingles missing like broken teeth, windows clouded with years of grime. Yet despite its outward neglect, there were signs of recent activity that made the outsider's skin tighten. Footprints pressed into the damp earth, the sharp scent of smoke lingering faintly in the air, and the subtle arrangement of rocks near the threshold hinted at deliberate care, rituals perhaps, rather than simple habitation. As he crept closer, he noticed the garden, or what had once been a garden, transformed into something grotesque. Rows of plants had been intertwined with scraps of cloth, animal bones, and pieces of metal, forming bizarre patterns that were impossible to ignore. It was as though someone had taken the earth itself and forced it into service for a purpose that was both deliberate and deeply unnatural. Around the edges of the clearing, symbols similar to those carved on the surrounding trees were etched into stones, painted faintly with some dark substance that caught the dim light and gleamed like blood in the shadows. The outsider's heart raced as he took in the full scale of the place. It was not merely a home but a stage, meticulously arranged for acts that had long ago departed from any sense of morality or ordinary understanding. Inside the main cabin, glimpses through warped, cracked windows revealed the faint glow of candlelight, flickering across walls lined with what appeared to be journals, bones, and ritual implements. Movement stirred within, but figures remained shrouded in darkness, their motions deliberate and unnervingly synchronized, like actors in a play designed to be seen by no one but themselves. The outsider realized that the homestead was not just a residence, it was a ritual ground, maintained with a precision that spoke of generations of devotion to acts that defied both nature and conscience. Even the air carried weight, thick with the scent of decay and something faintly metallic, a mixture that suggested both life and death were present, intertwined in ways he could not yet comprehend. Around the perimeter, the forest seemed to lean in, branches twisting as though to conceal the homestead further, offering glimpses only to those who dared approach with careful, measured steps. Each subtle sound, the snap of a twig, the distant caw of a bird, the whisper of wind through the leaves, felt amplified, each one a warning that the outsider was being watched, evaluated, measured against some hidden standard he could neither see nor anticipate. And as he lingered on the edge of the clearing, heart hammering, he understood that the family's isolation was deliberate, their compound carefully concealed not merely from the casual traveler but from anyone who might seek to intervene or bear witness. The deeper he gazed into the darkness of the homestead, the more certain he became that what he had discovered was not a simple residence, but the epicenter of a hidden world, a macabre theater where secrecy, death, and ritual converged in ways that would demand both courage and cunning to survive. The first encounter with the family was neither planned nor expected. It arrived like a shadow slipping through the forest, sudden and disorienting. The outsider had been lingering near the edge of the homestead, careful to remain hidden, notebook clutched tightly, heart hammering against his ribs as the dim candlelight flickered from within the cabin. At first, he saw only movement, dark shapes shifting behind the warped windows, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Then came the figures outside, moving with deliberate precision through the underbrush, their forms obscured by the night but unmistakably human. They wore simple, worn clothing, but the outsider immediately noticed the unnatural symmetry of their actions, the way they navigated the forest paths with a certainty that suggested intimate familiarity with every root, branch, and shadow. There was an eerie silence to their movements, no words passed their lips, no laughter or idle noise, only the quiet rhythm of feet against earth and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of chant-like whispers that seemed to merge with the wind. The outsider's breath caught as he realized that these were not ordinary inhabitants of the woods but participants in some ritual, their gestures and motions deliberate, purposeful, and chillingly synchronized. One figure knelt by a makeshift altar, hands moving in intricate patterns over objects that glinted in the faint light, the outsider unable to discern whether they were bone, metal, or something altogether stranger. Another figure circled slowly, almost reverently, carrying an object wrapped in cloth, its shape indistinct yet undeniably significant. As the outsider crouched behind a fallen log, he felt the forest around him shift, a subtle tension in the air that suggested awareness, as though the trees themselves were attuned to the family's presence and movements. Even as he attempted to record what he saw, his pen trembling, he understood that observation alone was dangerous. The family's focus was absolute, and any intrusion, however silent, could be detected. The deeper into the clearing the figures moved, the clearer it became that these rituals were not merely ceremonial but were bound to an ancient, incomprehensible logic, a code passed down through generations that intertwined belief, fear, and a reverence for forces the outsider could scarcely imagine. Every step, every gesture, every faint murmur of sound seemed to reinforce the invisible boundary between them and him, a line that, if crossed, might invite consequences beyond mere confrontation. And then, as the outsider's gaze lingered, he caught the first glimpse of a face pale, sharp-featured, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the night and through him, a momentary recognition that he was no longer an observer in a distant story but a participant, whether he wished it or not, in a ritual that had existed far longer than the surrounding town, longer than any law or morality, and which would test not only his courage but his very understanding of life and death. The outsider's worst fears were confirmed as he slowly pieced together the family's horrifying secret, a revelation that made his skin crawl and his stomach tighten with dread. He had seen the careful symmetry of their movements, the precision of their rituals, but he had not yet understood their true purpose until glimpses of the inner sanctum revealed the macabre reality. This family's devotion to preserving their bloodline had led them into acts that defied nature itself. Women were brought into the compound under varying pretenses, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through promises that were indistinguishable from superstition or duty. Within the dimly lit spaces, these women were subjected to ceremonies in which death and life were entwined in ways so grotesque that the outsider could hardly reconcile what he witnessed with anything he had ever imagined. The family's belief, passed down for generations, was that the dead could sustain the purity of the living, that lineage and ritual required no separation between life and death. They had developed methods, whispered in secrecy for decades, of impregnating women using the bodies of the deceased, a practice carried out with precision, care, and a fervent, almost religious, conviction. It was not random desecration but a deeply ingrained system, executed with a ritualistic discipline that seemed to sanctify each step, each motion, each chant. The outsider watched as members of the family moved with purpose around the altar-like arrangements, their faces a mix of reverence and calculation, hands steady even as they handled the impossible. Objects were prepared meticulously, herbs and oils combined, chants murmured in a language older than the surrounding town, each action reinforcing the belief that what they were doing maintained a sacred balance. The outsider's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the logic that allowed them to sanctify acts that would be called abomination by any other measure. Yet in their eyes, he glimpsed conviction, a devotion that transcended fear or morality, a willingness to go beyond the limits of human comprehension to preserve an ideal of bloodline and purity that had consumed their lives. The forest around the compound seemed to echo with the weight of these practices, a silent witness that had absorbed centuries of ritualistic horror and secrecy. Every creaking branch, every rustle of leaves seemed charged with the tension of acts performed long before he arrived and long after he might leave. In that moment, the outsider understood that this was more than mere superstition or cruelty. It was a worldview, a system of belief that elevated horror to ritual, death to service, and abomination to sacred duty. He realized that to fully understand this family, he would have to confront not only their actions but the centuries of logic and fear that had led them to create a world in which life and death were instruments of the same unyielding purpose. A world in which morality had been eclipsed by devotion to a tradition that had long since abandoned humanity. The outsider soon realized that witnessing the family's rituals was far more dangerous than he had initially imagined, and that danger was not abstract or distant, it was immediate, pressing, and suffocating. At first, he had convinced himself that careful observation, silence, and stealth would be enough to keep him safe, that he could document what he saw without becoming part of it, but the moment he crossed the threshold of the forest's inner sanctum, that illusion shattered. The family was alert in ways that seemed almost supernatural, attuned to the slightest disturbance, the faintest intrusion, the subtlest scent that did not belong. Even from the shadows, the outsider could feel their awareness, like invisible eyes tracing his every move, measuring his intent, assessing whether he posed a threat. The air itself seemed charged with warning, the faint rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, all of it combined into a symphony of unease that told him in no uncertain terms that he had trespassed where he was not meant to be. He witnessed the beginning of a ritual, the preparation of implements, the careful arrangement of elements that seemed designed to bridge life and death, and the realization struck him with a cold, visceral force. Any interruption could have consequences that went beyond mortal reckoning. Fear coiled around his chest like a living thing as he recognized that his presence alone had been detected, that every movement he made was being catalogued, judged, and recorded by eyes hidden yet unerringly precise. The family's members moved with deliberate calm, their motions fluid and synchronized, yet the outsider felt an almost imperceptible tightening of the invisible leash that held him in place. The forest itself seemed to conspire with them, guiding him, corralling him, ensuring that the boundaries he had assumed existed between observer and participant no longer applied. He was caught in a moral nightmare, a tense limbo in which stepping forward or retreating could both spell disaster. The chants, the low hum of ritual, the faint scent of herbs and decay mingling in the heavy air, pressed against his senses until he could scarcely separate observation from intrusion. Each heartbeat felt too loud, each breath a risk, as though the very act of being alive in that space violated some unspoken covenant. He understood that leaving quietly would not guarantee safety, that running could draw attention, and that any attempt to document the proceedings too overtly could provoke a response he was ill-prepared to withstand. The outsider's mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and calculations, but the creeping horror in his gut reminded him that none of his experience, none of his knowledge, had prepared him for the raw, unflinching vigilance of those who had bound themselves to a system of belief so absolute that intrusion, discovery, or defiance was not merely dangerous, it was intolerable, punishable in ways that could erase him from the world entirely. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but the pull of the story, the lure of understanding, bound him to a silent, perilous vigil in which the line between witness and victim blurred with every passing moment. As the outsider pressed further into the heart of the family's hidden world, fragments of history began to emerge, buried in the corners of the homestead and whispered by the subtle details around him. Old journals lay strewn across a rotting table, their pages yellowed with age, ink smeared by time and neglect, yet the words within held a chilling clarity that froze him in place. Each entry detailed generations of meticulous ritual, documenting not only the acts themselves but the family's unshakable belief that these practices maintained a sacred bond with forces that transcended mortal understanding. The outsider traced the faded handwriting, noting diagrams and symbols that mirrored those etched into the trees outside, seeing in them a consistent language that tied the present to centuries of precedent. There were letters, too, bound with fraying string, recounting interactions with outsiders who had stumbled too close, some left unharmed and forever changed, others never seen again. In these documents, the outsider began to discern a pattern. The family viewed their rituals not as acts of cruelty but as duties, necessary continuations of pacts formed long before the town existed, promises made to spirits of the forest, to ancestors whose voices and judgments still resonated in their ceremonies. Objects of devotion were scattered about the cabin, carved figurines, dried herbs, preserved fragments of unknown origin, each item catalogued and annotated with a reverence that bordered on obsession. The outsider realized that these relics were not merely ceremonial but instructive, evidence of a worldview in which morality, life, and death were subordinate to a sacred order maintained through precise and horrifying actions. Even as he absorbed the details, he became aware that the very arrangement of the homestead reflected this history. each room and clearing deliberately positioned to facilitate the rituals, each symbol serving as both warning and instruction. The outsider felt the weight of this accumulated knowledge pressing on him, a sense that he was intruding on a continuum that spanned generations and that the forest itself was an extension of the family's will, preserving memory and enforcing tradition through silence and observation. Every corner of the cabin seemed to murmur with the echoes of past ceremonies, the air thick with the residue of acts that had been performed long before his arrival and would continue long after. In that dim, musty space, the outsider understood that he was witnessing not only the present horror but the architecture of belief itself, a meticulous chronicle of devotion and obsession that had been cultivated over decades, shaping both the living and the dead in service of a ritual logic that was alien, unyielding, and terrifyingly coherent. As he traced the lineage of these practices, the outsider could feel the invisible tether of the past tightening, binding him to a story that extended beyond observation, a legacy of fear and fanaticism that demanded recognition, understanding, and an awareness of his own vulnerability within a system older and more powerful than he had ever imagined. As the outsider attempted to retreat, the tension in the forest thickened to a tangible weight, pressing against his lungs and quickening his heartbeat with every cautious step. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift with intent, elongating and bending as though they were sentinels watching his movements, guiding him, corralling him along paths he had not chosen. Every snapped twig beneath his boot sounded like a signal, every rustle of leaves a whispered warning, and he realized with chilling clarity that the woods themselves were complicit in the family's power, concealing their presence and facilitating their pursuit with an almost predatory patience. The outsider's earlier confidence in stealth and observation evaporated as he caught glimpses of figures moving at the periphery of his vision, always just out of reach, always silent, yet undeniably there. The deeper he penetrated the forest in an attempt to escape, the more the sense of being hunted intensified, the unseen watchers threading a web of tension that constricted around him. He began to recognize patterns in the forest's unnatural order, the way the paths narrowed, the way undergrowth seemed to rise to impede him, the subtle cues that suggested the terrain had been conditioned over generations to control movement and limit exposure. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to slow, to breathe, to observe, knowing that rash decisions could trigger a confrontation far worse than what he had already imagined. Each movement he made was mirrored by the forest's hidden forces, as if the family's influence had extended beyond the homestead, binding the land itself to their rituals and will. Occasionally, he glimpsed a figure just ahead, disappearing into the shadows before he could fully comprehend its form, leaving only the lingering impression of intent, purpose, and danger. The outsider's mind raced with strategies for escape, mapping the terrain, anticipating obstacles, yet all of his calculations felt provisional, fragile, insufficient in the face of a network of vigilance and preparation that was invisible yet omnipresent. The deeper he ventured, the clearer it became that the forest was a labyrinth designed to test, to intimidate, and perhaps to punish, that his intrusion had activated a system of surveillance and control refined over decades. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but it was also a tool, sharpening his perception, forcing him to notice the smallest details, the subtle shift in wind, the faint glimmer of candlelight through foliage, the barely audible cadence of chants that had traveled through the trees to meet him. Every instinct screamed that turning back would not guarantee safety, that pressing forward carried risks beyond comprehension, yet the forest offered no easy choice. With each passing moment, the outsider realized he was not merely navigating woods but a carefully constructed arena, a space in which every step was observed, every hesitation noted, and every miscalculation could have consequences that extended beyond the visible, into the realm of the ritualistic, the ancestral, and the unyielding will of a family whose reach was as intimate as the roots beneath his feet and as inevitable as the shadows lengthening around him. The outsider's growing understanding of the family's reach and influence reached a terrifying clarity as he pieced together the final, unsettling revelation. Their power extended far beyond the borders of the homestead, deeper than the forest, and even into the town itself. Every interaction he had with the villagers, every whispered warning and sidelong glance, suddenly carried a new, chilling weight. The fear that had seemed like simple superstition now revealed itself as evidence of a system of control and complicity that had endured for generations. The family had not merely isolated themselves, they had embedded themselves into the lives of the surrounding community in ways subtle, insidious, and all-encompassing. Farmers, shopkeepers, and even local law enforcement exhibited a caution that went beyond ordinary wariness, a deference born not of respect but of survival, a tacit acknowledgement that the family's reach was absolute, that crossing them or even appearing to notice them was a danger few could survive. The outsider realized that any attempt to escape with knowledge of their rituals, any effort to expose their deeds, could trigger consequences that were far-reaching and unpredictable, extending beyond immediate physical danger to the social and psychological fabric of the town itself. The villagers' silence was not mere ignorance, it was deliberate protection, both of themselves and of the family whose power they had come to recognize and fear. Even those who appeared indifferent were careful in their words and movements, suggesting that the family's influence was enforced not only through ritual or fear of reprisal but through a pervasive, almost unseen network of observation and subtle intimidation. The outsider understood that he had stumbled into a living, breathing system that had been refined over decades, a culture of secrecy maintained not by isolation alone but by the careful orchestration of perception, influence, and consequence. Each step he took through the woods, each glance toward the homestead, carried the weight of potential discovery, and he became painfully aware that the family's knowledge of his presence might already be complete, that he was walking through a landscape where being seen was only part of the danger. The realization settled like ice in his veins. He was not merely observing a hidden horror, he was a player within it, and the longer he remained, the more entwined he became in a web designed to preserve secrecy at all costs. His own movements, decisions, and thoughts were now subject to the invisible gravity of a system that had existed long before him and would continue long after. He could feel the pressure of inevitability, the understanding that the family's dominion was not limited to the supernatural or the macabre rituals he had witnessed but extended into the very structures of daily life around him. The outsider's mind raced, grappling with the implications of this realization, knowing that his survival, his ability to tell the story, and perhaps even the preservation of his own sense of self depended on navigating not only the forest and the homestead but the invisible, unyielding network of influence, fear, and power that the family had cultivated over generations, a network that left no one untouched and from which there might be no true escape.